All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into some roads to freedom, so to speak.
That sounds intriguing.
Yeah, we've got excerpts from Bertrand Russell's proposed roads to freedom. But alongside that, we also have some, how shall we put it, interesting copyright notices from a Project Gutenberg e-text of the same book.
Oh, wow. So it's like philosophy meets legalese.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's kind of like we're trying to uncover a hidden treasure map to freedom, but we have to decipher philosophical arguments and illegal jargon at the same time.
I am definitely up for this challenge. I think you'll find those legal bits might actually add a whole nother layer to how we think about freedom itself.
Okay, well, let's get into it.
Yeah.
So Russell lays out these three main paths. You've got socialism, anarchism, and syndicalism. Each of them is like a completely different vision of a society that's free from, oppression and exploitation.
Mm.
And Russell doesn't hold back at all. Like, check out this quote. "The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie." Bam.
Wow. Straight to the point.
Right. He's basically saying the state is just a tool that the wealthy elite use to keep their power.
It's important to remember the context here. Russell was writing in the early 1900s. That was a time of massive social and economic change. The Industrial Revolution had created huge amounts of wealth, but it also led to widespread poverty and inequality.
And Russell really captures that, the kind of stark reality that the working class faced back then. He has this one line about child labor in factories that's just heartbreaking. He writes, "Children of 9 or 10 years are dragged from their squalid beds, their limbs wearing away, their frames dwindling. Utterly horrible to contemplate."
It's that contrast, the contrast between the ideal of freedom and the very real oppression that so many people were experiencing. That's really what fueled all these movements Russell's exploring.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see how these movements, even though they're aiming for a better future, they kind of took on this almost religious fervor at times. Like Russell mentions the cult of Ravachol.
Oh, right, the French anarchist.
Yeah. He became like a martyr figure after he was executed, and his followers, they were using guillotine imagery, of all things. It makes you think about the powerful ways that people express their beliefs, even when those beliefs are about overthrowing the existing order.
Definitely. For a lot of people back then, these movements weren't just political ideologies. They were a source of hope, a belief in a truly radical transformation of society that would free humanity from oppression.
But even with the best intentions, there are practical problems that come up, like with socialism. One question is, how do you motivate people to work if everyone's basic needs are met no matter what?
That's a classic critique of socialism. How do you encourage innovation, productivity, all that, without the usual incentives? Some socialist thinkers had proposed different models, though, like focusing on intrinsic rewards, finding work that's purpose-driven, or maybe promoting a sense of shared ownership and responsibility.
And then there's the whole challenge of governing different regions in an ethical way, especially when you have these existing power imbalances. Russell tackles this head on when he's talking about applying socialist principles to places like Africa, which, were under colonial rule at the time.
Right. He recognizes the potential for exploitation even within a system that's supposed to be about equality. It raises all these questions about self-determination, respecting different cultures, and the whole issue of trying to apply universal principles in a world that's already so unequal because of its history.
It's kind of funny,
Yeah.
Here's Russell wrestling with these huge ideas about societal freedom. And then we have this Project Gutenberg legal text that's very specifically saying, hey, you're free to copy and distribute this e-text, but only if you don't make money off of it. So two completely different levels of freedom going on at the same time.
That actually makes you think. On the surface, it seems totally unrelated to the kind of massive societal change Russell's talking about. But that little detail about nonprofit distribution, it actually echoes his whole critique of capitalism. It's like it's saying that it's not just about outcomes, it's about motives, too.
You're right. It's like those dry legal details are actually hinting at this deeper concern.
Yeah.
With making sure knowledge is shared freely, not just used for profit.
Exactly. And it ties into Russell's whole idea that education is a key pathway to freedom. He argues that having access to knowledge, being able to think for yourself, those are essential for people to be able to make informed choices and really participate in shaping their own lives and the society they live in.
So we've got these different roads to freedom that Russell's laying out, each with its own strengths and potential problems. And then out of nowhere, this legal language about the ed text comes in, and it kind of adds this whole other dimension to the conversation.
It's almost like it's showing us that freedom isn't just this one thing. It exists on all these different levels, from the individual's right to access information to the fight for social and economic justice on a global scale.
And it's a fight, that's for sure.
Right.
Russell doesn't pretend that any of these paths to freedom are easy. He jumps right into the challenges, both the theoretical ones and the practical ones.
Yeah. He doesn't shy away from exploring the potential downsides, even for the systems he seems to like the most. He grapples with questions about human nature, about power, about the need to find a balance between individual freedom and the well-being of the whole society. And I think that's what makes his analysis so valuable, so timeless.
It's like he's reminding us that there's no simple solution, no magic wand to wave that'll suddenly create a perfectly free and just society. It takes a really deep understanding of human nature, both the good and the bad, and a willingness to keep trying things out, to keep talking and debating about how to make things better.
You know, it's really interesting how Russell doesn't present these roads to freedom as if they're just these perfect utopias. He actually gets into the weeds about the potential problems they could run into.
Yeah, he's not afraid to point out the messy reality, even when it comes to systems he obviously thinks are pretty good.
Hmm.
Like when he's talking about anarchism, he doesn't try to avoid the whole issue of, well, human nature.
Right, exactly. He acknowledges that even if you got rid of the state, people might still be driven by self-interest. And that could easily lead to conflict, make things unstable. It's a question that's been around forever for anarchist thinkers. How do you stop new forms of power from popping up when you don't have the traditional authorities in place anymore?
It's like that Lord of the Flies thing, isn't it? Get rid of all the rules. And then what happens? Do people just naturally start cooperating and living in harmony?
Well, Russell didn't think so. He understood that humans are complex, capable of doing great things, but also really terrible things. And while he believed that a more just society, one that's set up for cooperation, could encourage people to be more altruistic and, care about each other, he also saw that you'd still need some kind of safeguards, even in a system that's all about individual freedom.
So it's not enough to just tear down the old systems. You also have to think about building new ones that actually take into account how people behave, both the good and the bad.
Absolutely. And this leads him to suggest some things that might seem a little odd, coming from someone who's advocating for less state control, for example, he says. You'd probably still need some kind of law, even in an anarchist society, to deal with potential threats to individual liberty.
Wait, so he's not saying there should be no laws at all? That seems kind of counterintuitive, for an anarchist.
I think it's important to remember that anarchism isn't about just chaos or having no rules whatsoever. It's more about questioning authority, figuring out how to organize society based on people voluntarily working together and respecting each other. And Russell understood that even in a society like that, you'd still have to deal with things like theft or violence or people forming private armies, all of which could totally undermine the freedom that anarchism is supposed to be all about.
So it's less about rejecting all forms of structure and more about finding different ways to create order and make sure things are fair.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And you can see this really nuanced perspective. Throughout Russell's whole exploration of these different paths to freedom, he's always trying to balance individual autonomy with the need for people to take responsibility for the well-being of the whole group. He recognizes that. You can't really have true freedom without some sense of shared purpose, some commitment to the common good.
It makes me think about that quote we talked about earlier from the Project Gutenberg legal text, one about only being allowed to distribute the e-text for non-commercial purposes, like on the surface.
Yeah.
It's just a legal rule, but it also kind of reflects this deeper ethical idea.
Right. Like the idea that knowledge shouldn't be something you hoard or use to get rich. It should be shared freely.
Exactly. And it's so interesting how that connects to Russell's political philosophy.
It highlights how freedom is interconnected on all these different levels. Just like that legal text is trying to make sure information can flow freely. Russell's whole philosophy is about creating a society where everyone has the chance to develop their potential and really participate in shaping their own lives and the world around them.
It's like both the legal text and Russell's work are trying to answer this fundamental question. What does it actually mean to be free? And how do we create a world where that freedom isn't just an idea, but something everyone actually experiences?
That's the core of it. And that question becomes even more complicated when you start thinking about power. Russell knew that power isn't just about the state controlling things. It's also about economic power, social influence, even the power dynamics within personal relationships.
Yeah, like all those subtle ways people can be pressured or coerced, even when there's No one obviously in charge.
Exactly. And he argued that for freedom to be real, you have to address those power imbalances at every level, not just focus on getting rid of the state.
It really makes you think about all the ways people can be unfree, even in societies that claim to value liberty.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another really important part of what Russell was saying, the need for economic justice. He saw economic freedom as the basis for all other kinds of freedom. Like, if you're constantly struggling just to survive, to meet your basic needs, how can you really be free to make choices, pursue your goals, or live up to your full potential?
It's like you're trapped in this constant cycle of just trying to get by.
Yeah.
There's no space left to think about self-actualization or any of those higher-level ideas about freedom.
Exactly. And that argument, that economic justice is necessary for real freedom, it feels even more relevant today. With the gap between the rich and poor getting wider, and so much wealth concentrated in the hands of just a few, it's obvious that economic inequality is a huge threat to individual liberty and to democratic values.
So what Russell's saying is, it's not enough to just dismantle the state
Yeah.
or try to create some perfect utopia where everyone gets along all the time. You have to actually deal with the systemic problems that create inequality, whether it's in the economy or in society as a whole, or even in our personal relationships.
You got it. And that's what makes Russell's work so relevant, so insightful, even though he was writing over 100 years ago. He's reminding us that freedom is not some fixed endpoint. It's a process, a constant struggle to create a more just and equitable world. And that process means paying attention to how power works, understanding the balance between individual responsibility and collective responsibility, and really looking at how the systems we create shape our ability to be free.
It's like he's issuing a challenge, isn't it? To not just accept things the way they are, but to actively work towards creating a world where freedom is real for everyone, not just a privilege for a few. But it was like, where do we even start? Russell was living in a totally different world.
That's true. But even though the specific problems we face might be different, the fundamental questions he was wrestling with are still so relevant today. He was writing at a time of huge technological change, tons of social unrest, and this growing feeling of anxiety about the future. And in a lot of ways, we're feeling the same anxieties now.
Yeah, like we're dealing with a whole new set of technological disruptions. Social movements are pushing back against the established power structures. And there's this growing sense of urgency around things like climate change and economic inequality.
Exactly. And just like Russell was trying to make sense of his era, we have to figure out how to make sense of ours. There's no easy answers. We need to be willing to think critically, to experiment, to be flexible, and change our approaches as we learn more.
And maybe even try to have a little fun along the way. Who would have thought that a conversation about copyright notices could lead to such deep insights about freedom?
It's a good reminder that we can find wisdom and inspiration in the most unexpected places. And sometimes the most profound truths come out when you're just playfully exploring what seem like really ordinary details.
So as we keep going with this deep dive, let's hold on to that sense of playful curiosity. Let's be open to being surprised by the connections we find, by the ways that legal stuff, philosophical ideas, and personal experiences all come together in this ongoing search for what freedom really means. So, as we've been talking about all these different roads to freedom, there's one thing that I keep coming back to, this whole idea of human nature.
Yeah, what do you mean?
Well, it seems like on one hand, you have these systems that are designed to promote cooperation, equality, all that. But then on the other hand, people are, well, people. We have this drive to compete, to be selfish sometimes. How do you reconcile those two things? Like, are we just stuck with that conflict forever?
That is like the big question, isn't it? Are humans inherently good or bad? Cooperative or competitive? And Russell himself, he really struggles with that throughout his work. He doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he does suggest that. Even though human nature might have its limits, it's not like it's set in stone.
So you're saying we're not doomed to just be selfish jerks all the time?
Not necessarily. Russell argued that the systems we create, the environments we live in, those actually play a huge role in shaping how we behave.
Oh, interesting. So it's not all about our genes or whatever.
Right. He believed that if you created a society that was more just, more equitable, one that really valued cooperation and taking responsibility for each other, well, that could actually encourage people to be better, to tap into those more positive aspects of human nature.
So instead of just assuming everyone's greedy and out for themselves, what if we actually tried to build systems that encouraged people to be more collaborative, more empathetic?
Exactly. Russell thought that the capitalist system, with its focus on individual profit, competition, all that that it actually makes those more negative aspects of human nature worse. Like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The system pushes people to be selfish, which then just reinforces the system.
Yes, like a vicious cycle you can't escape.
Right. But Russell thought there was another way. He believed that if you created a society based on cooperation, where everyone had their basic needs met, where the goal was the common good, not just individual gain, then you could start to tap into those other parts of human nature. Compassion, altruism, a real concern for the well-being of others.
It's a pretty radical idea, isn't it? Like to just totally shift our mindset.
It is, but it's also a really hopeful vision to move beyond that whole dog-eat-dog mentality and start working together to solve problems, to build a better future for everyone.
And I think that ties into another point that Russell makes about the importance of finding work that's actually fulfilling.
Oh, absolutely. He felt really strongly about that. He believed that work shouldn't just be about earning a living. It should be a source of joy, creativity, purpose.
Yeah, like he talked about how even jobs that might seem kind of boring or repetitive could be transformed if you gave workers more control, more opportunities to be creative and work together.
Right. It's about making work meaningful, connecting it to something bigger than yourself, giving people a sense of ownership and pride in what they do.
Which is so different from how a lot of people experience work today, right?
Yeah.
It's just this grind, this thing you have to do to survive.
It is for a lot of people, unfortunately. But Russell's ideas give us something to strive for. A reminder that work doesn't have to be soul-crushing. It can actually be a source of fulfillment.
And it makes me think back to those Project Gutenberg volunteers we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, the ones who spend hours scanning and proofreading those old texts just to make them freely available to everyone.
Right. It's not exactly glamorous work, but they're obviously motivated by something more than just money.
What a perfect example. They're living proof that Russell's ideas aren't just pie-in-the-sky theories. They can actually be put into practice. We can make choices in our own lives that reflect those values.
And I think that's what makes Russell's work so powerful, so relevant, even all these years later. He challenges us to imagine a world where freedom isn't just this abstract concept, but something we experience every day. A world where we're not just free from oppression, but free to really become who we are, to live lives that are meaningful and connected to something larger than ourselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's really inspiring, isn't it, to think that we actually have the power to create a world like that.
It is. And as much as we've enjoyed going on this deep dive with you today, we really hope you'll take these ideas and continue exploring them on your own. Remember that freedom isn't just about individual liberty. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, to contribute, and to live a life that's full of meaning and purpose.
And never underestimate the power of ideas to change the world. Because, as Bertrand Russell showed us, the road to freedom starts with our imagination and the courage to pursue a better future.
So keep those insights close and keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep striving for that better world. Until next time.